Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the Swedish army on the continent spent a few frustrating years trying not to be destroyed by their imperial counterpart, as the Swedish leadership tried to figure out a way to either win the war or get out of it, all with limited success. Today that struggle continues, but by now, people are getting seriously fed up with the war. And I'm not only talking about the common people who had to suffer all the consequences, but also their leaders. The efforts to win the war, or at least reach a peace deal, intensify. Episode 91, Peace and Other Pipe Dreams. We left the Swedes last time with their backs against the Baltic Sea and the seemingly unstoppable Imperial army pushing its way north. But even though the Swedish forces were powerless to stop the Imperial advance, they were eventually saved by the bell. What saved the Swedes was the fact that they had pillaged and ruined the Pomeranian countryside so thoroughly over the last 8 years, so the Imperial commander Gallas soon ran into logistical problems. There was simply no food to be had for the soldiers, so they had to turn back before they could deal the final blow to the Swedes that would have forced them out of the Holy Roman Empire. It must have been a bitter pill for Gallas to swallow. He was so close to total victory, but he had to withdraw to keep his army from starving to death. So the Swedes lived to fight yet another day, and when the French money started to arrive in the spring of 1638, John Bannier could even start to plan for another campaign season. The war would go on. Bannier even received some 14,000 new recruits from home to fill out the thinning lines of his army, even though it took longer than expected to get everything in order. By the time Bannier and his army were ready, winter was already approaching. But going into winter quarters wasn't an option. As the army swelled, Bannier felt the pressure to go on the offensive, because Pomerania couldn't feed a Swedish army any more than an imperial one. So he set off southward, despite the weather turning colder by the day. After some looting and fighting during the winter, John Bannier took his new army all the way to Bohemia in the spring of 1639. This wasn't just Habsburg heartland, it was also a relatively prosperous region, which had enjoyed peace for the last 5 years. On May 20th, the Swedes stood outside the walls of Prague and declared that they'd come to liberate the city and the kingdom from papist oppression. But the locals weren't interested in being liberated and didn't let the Swedes in. And since John Bannier didn't have the equipment, the patience, or the skill to lay siege to such a formidable city, the Swedes didn't get any further. They let their frustration out on a unit of Hungarian soldiers who valiantly attacked, decked out in all their best finery. They were no match for the Swedes, who killed so many of them that they filled 8 wagon loads of dead Hungarians. Gallas and his army watched the slaughter from the safety of the city walls, but refused to sally out to aid the Hungarians. But that was the whole extent of the Swedish success this time around. Since Bannier and his army were incapable of taking Prague or any other major city or fortress, they wouldn't be able to hold on to Bohemia. So in October, when the campaign season was drawing to an end, Bannier gave the orders to burn, loot, and completely destroy the place. If the Swedes weren't going to be able to enjoy the land, neither were the Imperial side, or the Bohemians for that matter. The systematic destruction of Bohemia in the fall of 1639 was considered the worst so far in the 30 Years' War, which, as I'm sure you're aware of by now, was a war characterized by this kind of atrocities. Before the war started with the defenestration in Prague in 1618, Bohemia had a population of some 3 million people. When the war ended, there were only 800,000 left. More than 500 towns and almost 30,000 villages had been destroyed. A lot of that happened this fall as the frustrated Swedish troops withdrew. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire had a new emperor. Ferdinand III had succeeded his father, Ferdinand II, who died in 1637. Whereas the old emperor had been deeply pious, some have even characterized him as a fanatic with an uncompromising view of the war, focused on total victory against the Protestant heresy. His son and successor was far more pragmatic. Ferdinand III belonged to the growing circle of people who wanted the war to end. The sooner the better. Not only was he skeptical about the possibility to stamp out Protestantism in the Holy Roman Empire, he also feared that the war was undermining his imperial authority and may even threaten the continued cohesion of the empire as a whole. The destruction of Bohemia shook Ferdinand III and only strengthened his conviction that no good could come out of continued fighting. So he offered Sweden the port city of Stralsund and the island of Rügen in the Baltic Sea. But it wasn't enough for the Swedes, and they rejected the offer. Under the circumstances, the reluctant emperor saw no other alternative than to raise yet another army to send against the Swedes. But he didn't entrust these new soldiers to Gallas. Ferdinand wasn't going to let the incompetent drunkard loose yet another army, so he was relieved of his command. His replacement was none other than Ottavio Piccolomini, the man who'd commanded the imperial cavalry during the Battle of Lützen, and who had witnessed the final coup de grace against Gustavus Adolphus in November 1632. Piccolomini showed that the emperor's trust in him was well placed, as he spent the first months of 1640 pushing the Swedes out of Bohemia and then further and further to the north. The imperial army followed, but didn't really try to catch up with the Swedes. They weren't interested in a battle, only to get rid of the invaders. When the Swedes passed the river Elbe, they dumped 2,000 wagon loads of grain in the water. They weren't able to bring it along, and they weren't willing to let it fall into imperial hands. Distributing it to the hungry locals obviously wasn't an option. As his army was being pushed back, John Banner was fervently trying to stir the French to go on the offensive. He knew that he needed active French support to be able to relieve the pressure from Piccolomini. In the end, Banner was lucky, and thanks to Dutch military successes against Spain, the French could free up resources to send an army across the River Rhine and into the Holy Roman Empire. In the face of this new invasion from the west, several German principalities once again wavered and abandoned the emperor and joined the Swedish-French side. Among them were Lüneburg and Hesse. On May 6, 1640, the two allied armies, the Swedish and the French, met up on a field outside the city of Erfurt. From that moment, John Banner commanded a force of some 32,000 men. That was bad news for Piccolomini, who only had 10,000 soldiers. For the first time in years, ever since that fiasco at Nördlingen, the Swedish army was larger than its imperial counterpart. Once again, the war was going Sweden's way. Banner didn't waste any time. The day after he'd linked up with the French force and had assumed command over the whole army, he announced to his allies that he wanted to start the campaign season. His plan was simple: find Piccolomini and crush his army, preferably somewhere deep in the Habsburg heartland to the southeast, which he then planned to plunder for all it was worth. But to Banner's surprise and frustration, his allies started to protest, complain and argue against his simple plan. The problem was that the Hessian contingent had other plans. They wanted to march back west and raid together with the French in the Rhine Valley or the Spanish Netherlands. The officers from Lüneburg wanted to keep the army together because they worried that if the Swedes felt weak and threatened by Piccolomini, they would turn north and seek shelter and food in Lüneburg. In addition, the French actually had a secret deal with the Bavarians, promising to keep the Swedes from yet another plundering raid through the once rich and prosperous Catholic principality. Hours and hours were wasted in war councils that led absolutely nowhere. The increasingly angry and drunk John Banner shouted and waved his arms around at the representatives from France, Hesse and Lüneburg, but to no avail. When the army finally got going, Banner soon learned that Piccolomini was a much craftier foe than his predecessor, even though Gallas admittedly hadn't set the bar particularly high. The Swedes kept chasing after the imperial army, but Piccolomini kept his force just out of reach for the invaders, who were forced to march back and forth in regions that had already been plundered by warring armies. That meant that there was little food to be had, and the soldiers went hungry. It didn't take long until the constant companion of hunger showed up, namely disease. More and more soldiers fell ill, and not only soldiers. That summer, John Banner's own wife, Elizabeth Juliana, who had been traveling with her husband, fell ill and died. Banner was so crushed by her death that for a brief moment he considered giving up his command and retiring to Sweden to mourn his beloved wife. But in the end he decided to remarry instead. And less than 4 months after becoming a widower, he married a 16-year-old countess from Baden. When the campaign season ended in the fall of 1640, Baner found himself only 200 kilometers from where he had started with such high hopes in May. He'd been fighting all summer, but he hadn't accomplished anything. Only death, misery, and a new wife. He summarized 1640 as the worst year of the war since the death of Gustavus Adolphus, which says quite a lot considering what the Swedish army went through in the last episode of this podcast. Baner was tired and sick of it all. He ordered the army back to Erfurt to go into winter quarters. But as the dejected Swedish army was marching to Erfurt, dreaming of a few months of permanent roof over their heads, Baner received some interesting news. About 2 months earlier, in the middle of September, Emperor Ferdinand III had opened the Imperial Diet in the Bavarian city of Regensburg, historically known under the Latinized name Ratisbon, some 200 kilometers south of Erfurt. Now, not only the young emperor and virtually everyone who was anyone in the Holy Roman Empire was gathered in Regensburg discussing possible ways to end the war. Hearing this, the impulsive and bold Baner had an idea of his own about how to put a definite end to the war. His plan was simple, even simpler than his previous simple plan. He'd lead his army in a forced march as quickly as they possibly could, the 200 kilometers down to Regensburg, cross the frozen river Danube, surprise everyone and capture the emperor, his court, and all the German princes, dukes, bishops, and other prominent people before the imperial army would have time to react. Once all of the crowned heads of Germany were under his control, he'd be able to dictate whatever terms he liked and end the war within a few weeks, maybe even days. In the last days of December 1640, the Swedish army was told that their dreams of a roof over their heads would have to be put on hold. Instead, they set off south, marching as quickly as they could, not knowing where they were going. On January 3rd, 1641, they reached Auerbach, about 1/3 of the way to Regensburg. So far, they seemed to have gone undetected. No one had sounded the alarm, and the Imperial army was still spread out in its various winter quarters throughout eastern Bavaria. But then, Baner received some worrying news. An Allied cavalry unit reported that the Swedish army had been detected, and that the Imperial forces were now gathering as soon as they possibly could, in order to protect the Emperor and keep the Swedes from reaching Regensburg. This news gave Baner pause. He didn't want to risk continuing south if he was marching his army into the arms of an enemy that was ready and waiting. That would potentially turn into a bloodbath. Instead, he decided to stop in Auerbach for a few days to gather intelligence. He sent scouts out to find out what the Imperial forces were up to. So the Swedes spent a few nerve-wracking days in idleness, just waiting for news. But when the news started to filter back to Baner after about a week, he was confused by what he learned. None of his scouts had detected any enemy movement. In fact, it now seemed that the initial report had been incorrect. Someone had either made a terrible mistake, or, worse, intentionally misled him. But now, after a week of Swedish inactivity, the Imperial forces had been warned. Now they were really gathering, blocking further advance towards Regensburg. Nonetheless, Baner decided to press on. They'd come this far. He wasn't prepared to give up now and just turn around, so he pushed on towards the river Danube. And in the end, it wasn't Piccolomini and his hastily gathered forces that definitely put an end to Baner's simple plan, but rather a sudden change in the weather. So far, the winter had been cold, and the Danube had been covered in a solid layer of ice, which Baner had planned to march across. But now, the temperature had risen, and when Baner reached the banks of the river, he could see with his own eyes that the ice had broken up and the river was once again flowing freely, effectively blocking the access to Regensburg on the other side. The only thing the Swedish commander could do was to bring out his artillery and fire a few hundred useless volleys at the city on the other side of the river before he and his army were forced to turn around and march away. When they abandoned the attempt to capture the emperor and all those other leaders present at the Imperial Diet, John Baner wanted to take the army closer to the Bohemian border to find winter quarters. It was a relatively rich region where it would be easy to find food for the army, and it was an ideal point from which to start the summer campaign in Bohemia. But the French balked at this suggestion. They refused to go along with this plan and turned back west to winter in the Rhine Valley, close to the French border. So the two allies split up again, and it was a reduced Swedish army that prepared to spend what was left of the winter in eastern Bavaria, close to the Bohemian border. They spent most of January and February resting, stocking up on supplies, and watching Baner drinking himself into a stupor night after night. Everyone was doing well, except the commander's increasingly challenged liver, when a rider appeared in the evening of March 7th. He brought some troubling news. Piccolomini had apparently taken a page out of Baner's playbook, and he had gathered the whole Imperial army in secret, and now they were marching towards the unprepared Swedes. Fast. To make matters worse, Piccolomini had upgraded Baner's tactic, and the Imperial forces were approaching from two separate directions, trying to trap the whole Swedish army with a pincer movement. While the Swedes were scrambling to gather the army and get out of there before the trap slammed shut around them, the Imperial army was only 30 kilometers to the northwest. By now, the only thing that stood between them was a little town called Neuburg. When Piccolomini reached the town on March 10th, he demanded that the small Swedish garrison surrender. After all, they were surrounded and facing the might of the whole Imperial army. But the local Swedish commander refused. To his chagrin, Piccolomini realized he'd have to capture the town, otherwise the small garrison there would be able to attack his army in the back as they moved on. The Imperial commander wasted no time. He brought out all his artillery and started to bombard the town. The entire day, the cannons shot volley after volley at the outdated medieval city walls, reducing them to rubble. But the Swedes were busy filling the wide gaps in the walls with makeshift barricades of a kind that it would be very dangerous and costly to try and force through. Piccolomini still tried to take the town by storm, but after fierce fighting, the desperate Swedes managed to push them back. When the Imperial troops retreated, they left many of their comrades dead on the rubble and barricades. The following day, Piccolomini opened the fighting by reducing two of the towers in the city walls to dust, and then shooting at the section of wall between the destroyed towers until there wasn't a single stone left standing. His infantry almost managed to push through this new opening that was way too wide to block with barricades, but in the end the Swedes pushed them back yet again. But at this point, the Swedish officers started to ask their commander to just give up. They were running low on ammunition and would rather have an orderly capitulation than face a full storming without bullets to shoot back at the attackers. In the end, the commander agreed, and the Swedish garrison in Neuburg gave up. Piccolomini had won, but he had lost valuable time in the process. Too much time, it turned out. The stiff-necked Swedish defense of Neuburg had bought Baner enough time to get his army together and slip away. But it had been close. On March 17th, when the Swedes crossed the river Eger on a pontoon bridge they'd put together, they managed to get across and destroy the bridge with only half an hour to spare before the pursuing Imperial army showed up on the other river bank and started to shoot at the Swedes as they slipped away. Once again, John Baner had managed to execute a brilliant escape from an Imperial army. But as impressive as it was, it hadn't brought him any closer to victory. At the end of March, he and his army were yet again back in the vicinity of Leipzig, resting not too far from Breitenfeld. Baner himself really needed the rest. He suffered from a fever and was coughing up blood. He thought he'd brought it on by one of his angry outbursts, but it was more likely a symptom of liver cirrhosis, brought on by a lifetime of heavy drinking. He never recovered, and in the early morning of May 10th, 1641, he passed away. The news of Baner's death was greeted with glee among Sweden's enemies, who called him that old arsonist because of his treatment of the civilian population in the Holy Roman Empire. In Sweden, the news was received with far less enthusiasm. The Regency government feared that the death of their commander on the continent might lead to a crisis, and they were right. But the immediate threat didn't come from Piccolomini, but from within the Swedish army itself. Only a few days after Baner's death, 23 of the army's 30 colonels mutinied. The situation was extremely dangerous, with Piccolomini lurking on the horizon, so the generals had to cave. They let bribes, flattery, promises and lies rain over the rebellious colonels, who finally agreed to resume their duties. Crisis averted, for now. Neither side used the campaign season of 1641 to make any dramatic move. While the Swedes were busy finding a new commander and quelling a mutiny, the Emperor was reeling from the news that the new Elector of Brandenburg, Frederick William, had rejected the peace deal his father had signed with the Emperor, and instead he'd sided with the Swedes again. In November that year, Lennart Torstensson, the new commander of the Swedish army, joined his forces on the continent. He brought with him 8,000 new soldiers from Sweden, as well as more than 20,000 meters of fabric to make new uniforms. But most importantly, he brought along enough money to pay all the bribes his generals had promised the rebellious colonels. It cost him almost $500,000 to re-establish discipline in the army. But once he was firmly in control, Torstensson chose to demonstrate that he wasn't going to tolerate any further mutinies in his officer corps. He arrested the leading rebellious colonel and had him publicly executed. That, in combination with the money, ensured that no colonel would ever dare to rebel against Lennart Torstensson. What the spooked colonels didn't know was that Torstensson discreetly used his own personal funds to make sure the executed colonel's widow and children, who weren't responsible for his crimes, would be properly looked after. He may have been a ruthless military commander, but he did have a strong moral compass. Another extraordinary indication of that is the fact that he was the only military commander in the 30 Years' War, both on the Swedish and Imperial side, who didn't exploit his position to enrich himself. But make no mistake, even though Torstensson lived by a strict moral code, he was no softy. He was just as ready as everybody else to burn villages, kill civilians, and send his soldiers to their deaths. The biggest difference between him and Banér was that Torstensson could control his alcohol intake, and that he had the knowledge of how to lay siege to cities and fortresses. The latter skill would come in handy in the coming years. At the end of March 1642, Torstensson was ready to take his new army on a test spin. Just like Banér had been, Torstensson was focused on the Habsburg heartland, but instead of approaching from the west, he decided to try his luck from the east, through Silesia, in what's today southwest Poland. Here, Torstensson's capability to take fortified cities and castles paid off. Town after town fell to the Swedes, who could stock up on all kinds of goodies and demand tribute from the conquered Silesians. By the beginning of July, most of Silesia and Moravia were in Swedish hands. Some Swedish troops stood only 40 kilometers north of Vienna. The very center of the Holy Roman Empire was under threat. But the Swedish army was starting to stretch itself a little too thin. Capturing all those towns and castles had meant that Torstensson had been forced to leave garrisons to guard all those newly acquired places. Now his army was starting to be rather small. Another factor that thinned the lines was desertions. Especially cavalrymen had a tendency to desert. Perhaps counterintuitively, they deserted not because the war was going badly, but because it was going so well. Many, if not most, of the cavalrymen had enlisted because they hoped to make a fortune fighting. And all the plunder and looting in the first half of 1642 meant that they now had their pockets full of gold. Why risk their ill-gotten gains, not to mention their lives, by staying in the army when they could just as well ride off into the sunset and start a new life, living comfortably somewhere far away from the fighting? That temptation proved to be too big for enough cavalrymen that it started to become an issue for the Swedish army. So by July 1642, Torstensson only had about 11,000 men left. That was bad news, especially now when Piccolomini had managed to raise yet another army that was twice as large and was marching it toward the Swedes. Torstensson had no other choice than to retreat to avoid the Imperial army, and this retreat continued for the rest of the summer and into the fall. In the end, the Swedish army once again found itself retreating north with the superior Imperial army in pursuit. When Torstensson once again reached Leipzig in mid-October, 2/3 of the army that he had ordered into Silesia that spring was gone. Still, he intended to put the third he had left to good use. His plan was to capture Leipzig and then spend the winter there, eating through the stores and larders of the peace-loving, flip-flopping Elector of Saxony. But unlike so many cities in Silesia and Moravia, Leipzig refused to surrender to the Swedes. They were hoping the Imperial army would save them before the Swedes managed to capture the city by storm. And their hope was well founded. The Imperial army under the command of the Emperor's brother, Archduke Leopold William, was fast approaching to relieve the important but poorly defended city. When Torstensson learned that the Imperial forces were coming, he quickly ordered his army to break off the siege and get ready to march away. On October 22nd, the Imperial army arrived outside Leipzig, only to discover that the Swedes had fled the field. Leopold William decided to chase after them, and early in the morning of October 23rd, the Imperial army continued north in the direction of a village called Breitenfeld that you may have heard of before. At around 7 in the morning, the first Imperial troops, chasing after the retreating Swedes, passed over the crest of a low ridge. But there, they stopped dead in their tracks. On the other side of the ridge stood the Swedish army, in full battle formation. As soon as Leopold William's soldiers reached the top of the ridge, the Swedish drums sounded, and the army started to move against their surprised and unprepared pursuers. The hasty retreat from Leipzig had been a trick, and it had worked. Leopold William had been lulled into a false sense of security and superiority and had stumbled into a trap. The Imperial army wasn't ready to do battle. No ammunition had been distributed among the soldiers, and the pistols belonging to the cavalry were still safely stowed away somewhere in the baggage train. Leopold William did what he could to save the situation. He brought forward the Imperial artillery and ordered the cannons to fire at the approaching Swedes, trying to slow them down and giving the army time to get ready for battle. But even though the Imperial projectiles tore deep gashes into the Swedish lines, the army pressed on. The Swedish cavalry attacked the Imperial cavalry 3 times until they broke and fled in panic, despite Leopold William's attempts to steady the line with a combination of encouragement and threats. The horsemen, who couldn't turn around and gallop away, threw down their weapons and surrendered to the Swedes. The infantry soon followed suit. This, the second Battle of Breitenfeld, was every bit as much a Swedish triumph as the first one had been. After only 3 hours, the Imperial cavalry was completely dispersed. The infantrymen were all either dead or captured. All their cannons and the whole baggage train had also fallen into Swedish hands, including the Imperial war chest and the Archduke's personal papers, servants, orchestra, and portable chapel. But the Archduke himself managed to flee the scene of the military disaster. When he was back in Prague and looking for someone to blame, he court-martialed a whole regiment for cowardice. The senior officers had their heads cut off, the junior officers were hung, and 1 in 10 of the soldiers were shot. Then he dissolved the unit. Meanwhile, the victorious Swedish army marched the short distance back to Leipzig, which now opened its gate to them. In order to escape plunder, the city also paid 150,000 thaler. Still, Torstensson wasn't particularly happy when he summarized what he had achieved in 1642. Despite all his successes, he hadn't been able to keep control over Silesia and Moravia, and victory seemed just as elusive as the year before. But even though he hadn't captured and kept any land, his campaign had left its mark at the imperial court. Torstensson had proven to be a formidable foe, and in combination with the French operating in the Rhine Valley, more and more people surrounding the emperor started to urge him to reach a compromise with the Swedes. The sooner the better. The Elector of Bavaria had even started secret back-channel negotiations with Paris for a separate peace. None of that would have happened if it hadn't been for Torstensson and his exploits in Silesia and Moravia, not to mention the Second Battle of Breitenfeld. Maybe 1643 would be the year the war finally ended. Spoiler alert, it wouldn't. But the Germans would at least get a little break in the fighting, because Torstensson and his army would all of a sudden receive news that they were needed elsewhere. And they were already late. More about that next time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as wake up early if you want another man's land or life. Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies. Or speak useful words or be silent. Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer Twitter, or X as it's called these days, then you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.